I want to talk about his father, Haizar.
Then let's talk about yours.
She sat down across from him. No Miho beside her. No Seo-jun at the back of the room. No exit code held warm in her memory. No 4 words delivered in a corridor before the danger. Nothing behind her except 5 months of paying the kind of complete, unhurried, total attention to a world that had not expected to be paid attention to at all. Chairman O looked at her across the small private table. He had been reading people for 40 years. Not the surface of them, the architecture. The load-bearing walls. The thing a person was protecting and the specific pressure required to make it give way. He had built more with that skill than with any other resource available to him across 6 decades of operating in the spaces between the legal world and the one underneath it. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, I want to talk about his father. And Zola Mensah, who had been given the full history at a kitchen table at midnight by a man who had promised everything on the table and no more silence as protection, who had sat on the edge of her bed alone deciding what she would and would not give, who had walked through this door the way she walked through every door since October, looked at Chairman O directly across the small table. And she said, Then let's talk about yours. The silence that followed was the largest silence in 4 parts of this story. Larger than the driveway. Larger than the kitchen floor. Larger than a room of 12 men going quiet when she said her name. This silence had 40 years of O's careful, patient, architectural control sitting inside it and a woman from Accra and Atlanta sitting across from it, and neither of them looked away. And then, for the first time in longer than anyone in his world could remember, Chairman O smiled. Not the pleasant, weaponized warmth he deployed as a precision instrument. Not the warmth of a man managing an exchange. A real one. Small. Surprised. The expression of a man who has been doing this for 40 years and has just encountered something that has no category in the system he has been operating within for the whole of his professional life. This is part 4. This is what happens when a woman who asked about coffee sugar on her first day sits down alone across from the most patient predator in Seoul and turns the conversation entirely around. Before anything else, if you are new to this story, stop right now. Go watch parts 1, 2, and 3. All 3 of them in order. The links are in the description and the playlist. Come back when you have watched all of them. What happens in this room today will not carry the weight it is supposed to carry without the driveway, without the kitchen floor, without her name said in a room of 12 men. Everything that happens here is built on everything that came before it. Go watch it. Come back. For everyone who is here because part 3 ended and they could not wait, subscribe right now and turn on every notification. Because what Zola says in that room today is the thing this entire series has been building toward since the first morning she made his coffee with 2 sugars and asked Mrs. Park about coffee sugar and watched her walk away shaking her head. 7 days after the gathering. 7 days after both of you. Sit down. 7 days of the house continuing to be the warm inhabited thing it had been learning to be since October, except now there was a name for what it was becoming. Home, she had said in the car on the way back from the gathering, and the word had sat between them on the back seat of the moving car like the most significant word in 5 months of significant words. 7 days. And then O's people had reached out and the meeting had been arranged, and now the morning of it had arrived like all significant mornings arrive, without announcement, looking exactly like an ordinary morning, giving you no indication of what it intended to contain. She made his coffee. 2 sugars. She had been making it this way for 5 months, and the weight of the cup and the temperature of it and the 2 sugars had become one of the fixed points of the day. One of the things that was simply true now, the way the plant on the windowsill was simply true, the way his hand over hers on the table in the morning was simply true. Things that had started as small and had grown, without anyone narrating the growth, into the load-bearing structures of a life. He was already at the table. Not reading anything. She noticed this the moment she came in because in 5 months she had never once come to the kitchen in the morning and found his hands empty. He was just sitting, looking at the plants on the windowsill, the original and the second, both doing well now, the second one thriving in the stronger light of the east corridor window visible through the kitchen doorway. The city was outside. The morning was doing what Seoul mornings did, arriving with that cold gold light that could not decide between warmth and restraint. Neither of them spoke for the first 10 minutes. This was not unusual. The mornings had their own silence now, a chosen silence, the silence of 2 people who had arrived somewhere they had not been before and were living in it without feeling the need to describe it. But this morning the silence had something in it, not tension exactly, something more like the quality of air before a significant change in weather. She set his cup down. She sat across from him. She wrapped both hands around her own cup. She looked at him, looking at the plants. "Tell me one more thing about him," she said. "Something you haven't told me yet." "I've told you everything," he said. "You've told me the professional everything. The history and the networks and the architecture of how he thinks and what he builds toward and what the meeting is designed to establish." She paused. "Tell me something personal. Something about who he is when no room is watching." He was quiet. He looked at the second plant, the one doing better in stronger light. He looked at it for a long time, the way he looked at things he was deciding about. Then he said, quietly, "He had a daughter. She died 12 years ago. Same year my father did." She went completely still at the counter. "He has not been the same kind of man since," Minho said. "He was building toward something before that. Specific things. Things that had a particular shape. After, the shape changed. He started building toward harder things. Things that looked like empire and worked like empire, but I have never been entirely certain that empire is what they were actually for." She looked at him. "Does he know you know that?" "No one knows that," he said. "I found it in my father's private files 3 years ago. A photograph. Notes. The specific quality of grief in my father's handwriting when he described it." The kitchen was quiet. She sat with this for a long moment, not performing composure, actually sitting with it, turning it over the way she turned everything over, with the complete unhurried attention she had brought to every significant thing in this house since October. Then she said, not quite to him but as much to herself as she processed it aloud, "Okay." He looked at her. "Zola, whatever you're thinking, I'm not going to use it against him," she said. Immediately. Flatly. The way she said things she had already decided. "That is not what I do." She paused. "But it changes what I understand about what he wants. And that changes how I sit in that room." She stood. Took her cup to the counter. She stood there with her back to him for a moment, and then she said the thing that stopped him completely. The thing he had been turning over for 3 years since he found those files and read his father's handwriting and had arrived, across those 3 years, at every interpretation except the correct one, and she found it in 45 seconds over a cup of morning coffee. "He's not building toward an empire anymore, is he?" she said. Her back still to him, looking out the kitchen window at the garden below. "He hasn't been for 12 years. He's building toward something else." She paused. "And whatever it is the reason he has been watching you. Not to take what you have built. Not to absorb it or dismantle it or use it as leverage. To see whether you are the kind of man who would understand what it was supposed to be for." She paused again, longer. "And then I walked in. And something in what he was seeing changed. And the question shifted from, is the son capable, to, is the son, finally, with this woman beside him, something more than capable?" She turned and looked at him. "I'll see you tonight," she said. She walked out of the kitchen. He heard her footsteps on the stairs. He sat at the kitchen table with his coffee and the morning light and the plants on the windowsill and the specific, enormous, devastating quality of a woman who had just named in 45 seconds the thing he had been carrying for 3 years and had never once been able to name himself. Not because he lacked the intelligence. Because the intelligence was not what the naming required. What it required was the specific kind of attention she had brought to this house since October, the kind that looked at things directly without needing them to be anything other than what they were. He sat for a moment. Then he called Co. June. The car stopped across the street from the private establishment at 1:45 in the afternoon. The Seoul afternoon was cold and bright, the kind of bright that comes from a high clear sky that is giving you light without warmth. She was looking at the building. He was looking at her face. Between them in the back seat of the car was the specific quality of silence that belongs to two people who have said everything that can be said and are now simply in the last moment before the thing they have been preparing for. "I'll be here," he said. "I know," she said. "If you need to leave at any point during the conversation." "I won't need to leave." "If you want to," he said. "Not need. Want." She turned from the window and looked at him. His sharp, angular Korean jaw set with the effort of stillness. his cold dark hooded eyes on her face with the expression that only existed in cars and kitchens and dark hallways and driveways, the expression with all the architecture stripped away, the one that had no distance in it, the one that had been building since the first night. He looked away first in a hallway at 2 a.m. and had been arriving more fully at the surface of him with every part of this story. "Are you afraid?" she said. The pause that came after this question was the longest pause in the series. Not the controlled, professional pause of a man managing information. The honest pause of a man sitting with a question that deserves a true answer and taking the time to find it. "Yes," he said. She looked at him for a moment with everything she knew of him and everything she had learned about the specific cost of things in his world. "Good," she said. "Hold on to it. It means you understand what this is and what it matters." She paused. "I'll be back." She opened the door. She stepped out into the cold, bright Seoul afternoon, and the city was around her, enormous and continuous and entirely indifferent to the specific gravity of what was walking through it, and she did not look back at the car. She walked toward the building with the same quality of walking she had carried since the first night she crossed his hallway at 2 a.m. with her cleaning equipment, completely present, completely certain, completely herself. The establishment's door was unmarked from the outside. It opened as she approached. She went through it. The door closed. The car was quiet. Minho was looking at the door. The closed door, on the other side of which she was now moving through a building without him beside her for the first time in 5 months of danger and kitchens and corridors and gatherings. He was looking at it with the full weight of what it meant to be the person on this side of a door for the first time in 34 years. Seo-jun was in the passenger seat. Neither of them spoke for several minutes. The Seoul afternoon moved around the car, traffic, pedestrians, the city doing its city things with complete indifference. Then Seo-jun said, "Sir." "Don't," Minho said. "I need to say it," Seo-jun said. Minho said nothing. He was still looking at the door across the street. "I spent 4 months being afraid of what she was doing to your operation," Seo-jun said. He was looking straight ahead through the windscreen. His voice had the quality of something that has been carried a long way and has reached the place where it can finally be set down. "I ran contingencies on her from week 2. I updated files. I categorized her as a variable, a complication, a risk to be assessed and managed. Every week I told myself I was being responsible, and every week what I was actually doing was being afraid of something I did not have a category for." He paused. "I was wrong about what she was. Not because she isn't changing things. She is. She has changed more things in this house in 5 months than anything in the previous 12 years. But because the things she is changing needed to be changed. And I knew that by the kitchen floor. I knew it when she went to the north exit door and closed it and came back. And I filed it and said nothing because saying it out loud would have required me to admit something." "What would you have had to admit?" Minho said. Quietly, still looking at the door. "That I had been wrong from week 2, Seo-jun said. And that the thing I had been categorizing as a risk to the operation was actually the most important thing that had ever walked through the front gate." He paused. "I wanted you to know that I see that now. That I saw it at the kitchen floor and chose not to say it then, and that was a failure I am correcting now. Because she just walked into a building alone on behalf of an empire she has no legal, contractual, or personal obligation to protect, without an exit strategy, without backup, without anything except 5 months of paying complete attention. And she did it without hesitation. And the only reason she is doing it, the only reason any of this is happening, is because she looked at what you have built and decided it was worth standing beside." The car was very quiet. Seoul was outside being Seoul. "She's going to be fine," Minho said. "Yes, sir," Seo-jun said. A pause that had 12 years in it. "I know," Seo-jun said. And they sat in the car with the door across the street and the afternoon moving around them and the thread they were both holding from their end. Seo-jun having said the thing he had been carrying and Minho having received it, and neither of them making more of it than it was, because it was simply true and the truth was enough, and this was the specific economy of a 12-year partnership that had just, in a parked car on a side street in Seoul, become something slightly different than it had been. In 34 years John Minho had not waited like this. He had always been the one in motion. The one with the contingency, the one running the secondary calculation, the one who was always already 3 moves ahead of whatever was in the room with him. He had built his entire life on the principle that preparation was the only form of safety available to a person, and that trust was the door you left open that your enemies walked through. He had lived inside that principle since he was 17 years old, and it had kept him alive and operational and in control of every variable he had ever encountered. And now he was sitting in a parked car watching a door. With nothing. No strategy. No contingency. No secondary screen running in the back of his mind. Just the door across the street, and the knowledge that she was on the other side of it, and the specific, terrifying, entirely unprecedented experience of having nothing left to do but hold his end of the thread and trust that she was holding hers. He had been afraid of this. He had known since part one, since the first night she stood in his hallway and didn't flinch, that this was where it would eventually lead. Not the danger. Not the meetings and the gatherings and the men with cameras outside the gate. The thing he could not run a contingency on. The experience of mattering to someone and them mattering back, and both of you knowing it, and there being nothing left to do but live inside that truth without a wall around it. The door across the street did not open for 1 hour and 47 minutes. The room was smaller than she had expected. Not the long table of the gathering, not the architectural power of the assembled network's informal configuration. A square table. 2 chairs facing each other directly. A window on the far wall overlooking a quiet residential street, not Seoul's main arteries but one of the older streets, the ones that still had the specific quality of a city that knew its own history. Tea already poured and waiting, 2 cups, both of them at room temperature, which told her they had been there long enough that she was not the first thought in the room's preparation. Min Ji-yeon, O's assistant, late 20s, sharp and quiet in the way of someone who has been beside a significant person long enough to understand things that person doesn't know she understands, had shown her in and closed the door from the outside without a sound. They were alone. O was already seated. He had stood when she entered. She filed this. She sat. He sat. They looked at each other across the small table with the specific quality of 2 people who are both, in different ways, very practiced at this, at rooms and conversations and the particular game of who will define the register of the exchange and how. Neither of them picked up their tea. "Thank you for coming," O said. The pleasantness was there, the warm precision instrument she had been briefed on. She received it for what it was. "Thank you for asking directly," she said. The fractional pause that followed told her the directness had registered in the specific way she had hoped it would, not as aggression, as signal. She was not going to perform her way through this conversation. She was going to be exactly who she was and let the room do what it did with that. He said, "I want to talk about his father." She said, "Then let's talk about yours." The room went still in a way that rooms rarely go still in her experience. Not the stillness of threat or surprise, but the stillness of something that has just changed the register of the exchange entirely. O looked at her. The 40-year face, the face that had been the most controlled face in every room it had occupied for 4 decades, did something she had been watching for since she sat down. Something shifted. Not cracked. Not broken. Shifted. Like a very precise instrument being recalibrated by a single unexpected input. "He told you," O said. "He told me everything," she said. "That was a promise he made. At a kitchen table. His hand over mine. No more silence as protection. Those were the exact words. And you came anyway." "I came because of it," she said. "Because when someone tells you everything and keeps their promise, you understand the full weight of what you're walking into. And you walk in anyway because the full weight is exactly why it matters." O looked at her. Something in his face, the expression Miho had described at the kitchen table after she asked about the look that appeared when O respected something, was arriving. She recognized it because she had been told what to look for. It looked like nothing from the outside. It looked like a man sitting very still. From the inside it was a complete reassessment. "What do you want from this meeting, Ms. Mensah?" he said. "The same thing you want," she said. He said, "And what do I want?" She leaned forward slightly. Not toward him physically. More the lean of someone arriving at the thing they have been thinking about since midnight. "You want to understand what is actually happening in that house," she said. "Not the surface of it. Not the narrative that explains a Mafia boss's body language at a gathering. The real of it. The substance underneath the shape. Because you have been watching John Miho for 12 years, and for 11 of those years what you saw was an empire being constructed with extraordinary precision. You looked for the weakness in it and found nothing because there was nothing to find. The construction was immaculate. And then a woman arrived in October and asked about coffee sugar on her first day, and the house started changing in ways that your instruments could detect but not explain. And you have spent 5 months trying to understand what kind of change it is. O was looking at her with the expression she had been waiting for. "You're here to tell me," he said. "I'm here to offer you something better than telling," she said. The room was very still. O leaned back very slightly, the movement of a man who recognizes that he is about to receive something that will require him to update his understanding of the world and is making room for it. "I'm listening," he said. She held his gaze. "You have been building toward something for 12 years that is not about the empire," she said. "I know that now. The empire is the method. It is not the destination. And what you have actually been building toward, what you have been watching the sun for, through all the patience and all the years, is the thing the Father promised you and never lived to deliver." O went completely still. The specific stillness of a man hearing something said out loud for the first time that has lived entirely in his interior for 34 years. "Miho doesn't know what it was," she said. "It is not in the files. Whatever the promise was, it existed between two people who kept it between them. But you know, and I think that in 12 years of watching him build what his father built, you have been asking yourself a single question, over and over, with the patience of someone who has decided the outcome and is simply waiting for events to catch up with it." She paused. "The question is not, is Miho capable? The question is Miho the kind of man who would choose it?" And the answer, for 11 years, was, probably. But not yet. Not alone. Not without something he doesn't have yet and doesn't know he needs. She looked at him directly. "And then I walked through his door. And you watched the house change. And the question shifted." O looked at her for a very long time. "You are saying a great deal," he said carefully, "for someone who has been in this city for 5 months. "I am saying a great deal," she said, "for someone who has been paying complete attention for 5 months." She held his gaze without dropping it. "Tell me what his father promised you. Tell me what you have actually been waiting for. And I will tell you whether Miho can deliver it. Not because you have leverage over him. Not because I am negotiating on his behalf. Because this has been sitting unresolved for 34 years and it is the right thing to resolve. And you know that," she said. "Or you would not have called the meeting." O looked at her for a long moment. Then he did something she did not expect. He reached forward and picked up his tea, the cup that had been sitting at room temperature since before she arrived, and he held it in both hands the way someone holds something warm when they are about to say something they have not said in a very long time. He drank from it. "Set it back down. Miho's father and I grew up in the same district," he said. His voice was different now, not the pleasant weaponized warmth and not the formal register of the gathering. Something older. Something that had been in a drawer for 34 years and was being carefully, deliberately, taken out. "Before either of us was anything. Before the networks and the power and the fear. He was the one who saw what was possible. I was the one who was willing to be patient while it became possible." He paused. "We built the first network together. Equal. That was not a handshake agreement. It was the way we thought of it, the way we spoke of it, the foundation that everything we built together was built on." "And then he was shot," she said quietly. "And then he was shot," O said. "And the empire passed to his son. Not to both families. To the son alone. Because that was how it had been structured. Not by agreement, by the specific way the inheritance had been arranged in the years before his death, when he was already aware that the world they were operating in was not a world that guaranteed anyone a particular length of life." He paused. "I watched the son take it. I watched him build it. I waited for the right moment to approach, to say, 'Your father and I had an agreement.' And then I waited longer because the right moment required the son to be the kind of man who could receive the agreement and choose to honor it. And that required something I could not manufacture from the outside." She waited. "There is a network in this city," O said. He was looking at the window. The quiet street outside. The older soul visible in it. The part of the city that remembered what it had been before the glass and the money arrived. His voice had the quality of something being narrated for the first time after a very long silence. Not criminal. Older than criminal. A structure that has been operating in the district we grew up in for 60 years. Longer than either of us has been alive. It exploits the people of that district in ways that are entirely invisible to the city above it, through debt and housing and the specific, patient, long-term extraction of resource from people who have no mechanism to recognize what is being done to them. He paused. My daughter grew up in that district. She did not survive what that district does to people. He stopped. The room held this for a moment. His father and I, before any of the empire, before any of the power, promised each other that when we had built something strong enough, we would use it to dismantle that network. Completely. Not for expansion. Not for territory. Because it was the right thing. Because it was the thing we had originally decided the building was for. And he died before it happened, she said. And he died before it happened, O said. And his son has been running the empire for 12 years without knowing that is what it was always supposed to be for. The room was still. You have been watching Minho for 12 years to see if he is the kind of man who would choose to do it, she said. Yes. And you decided that alone, without the right circumstance, without the right person beside him, he wasn't ready. Until the gathering, O said. He looked at her. Until you walked through the door. She sat with the full weight of everything in the room for a moment. 34 years of a promise sitting in a private room in Seoul. A man who had been carrying it alone since the day his partner was shot in the back of a car on a Tuesday afternoon. A son who had been running an empire for 12 years without knowing what it was supposed to be for. And a woman from Accra and Atlanta who had arrived in October with a suitcase and a question about coffee sugar and had been paying complete attention ever since. You need to tell him yourself, she said. O was quiet. Not through me, she said. Not through an arrangement or an intermediary or a message that arrives in his office that he reads alone. You sit across from him the way you are sitting across from me right now, and you tell him what his father promised and what you have been waiting for. He deserves to hear it from you. In your voice. The way you just told me. O looked at her for a long time. And if I do, will he be the kind of man who chooses to honor it? She thought about a man who stood in a driveway and said please. Who watched her cry in a garden and made one phone call and never mentioned it. Who washed a teacup in the dark and returned it to its place before morning. Who moved a plant to a window with better light and mentioned it over breakfast as if it were nothing. Who said 4 words to Seo-jun before walking into danger, and those 4 words were not about the operation or the network or the estate. They were, make sure she gets out. Yes, she said. Without any hesitation at all. He already is. O picked up his tea again. He held it. He looked at the window. Then he looked back at her. Sit with me a little longer, Ms. Mensah, he said. And she did. They sat in that small private room for another hour and 20 minutes. The tea went from room temperature to cold. Min Ji-yeon, on the other side of the door, heard the quality of the conversation inside change at some point in the second hour, the register shifting from negotiation to something else, something she had not heard in the room in 7 years of standing outside it. Something that sounded like 2 people talking about the same thing from the same side of it. When the door opened and Zola came out, Min Ji-yeon was the one who saw her face first. She stood in the corridor and looked at the woman who had walked into that room, and she thought, in the specific, private way of someone who has watched a powerful man operate for 7 years and understands the specific weight of what it means when his face does something unexpected, she thought, he told her everything. And she told him something back. And neither of them will be the same kind of fixed point they were an hour and a half ago. She thought about this for the rest of the afternoon. The door of the establishment opened onto the cold, bright Seoul street, and Minho was already moving before the door had fully swung. He had opened the car door before he consciously decided to. He was on the pavement and crossing the street before Seo-jun could say anything, and Seo-jun, who had spent 1 hour and 47 minutes watching the door from the passenger seat with the specific stillness of a man who is being very disciplined about not watching the clock, simply let him go. She was crossing toward him. He read her face the way he had learned to read it across 5 months of mornings and silences and candles and kitchens and cars and corridors and every significant thing that had happened in this story. She was steady. She was sure. She was carrying something significant in a way that was visible to him because he had learned the specific way she carried significant things. Quietly, with her shoulders level and her eyes doing the work that her face was too composed to show. They met in the middle of the street, which was also the middle of Seoul, which was also the middle of an afternoon that had started in a kitchen and was ending on a pavement in the kind of open air that John Minho did not usually do significant things in. "Are you all right?" he said. "Yes," she said. "What happened?" She looked at him. Her large, warm, dark brown eyes, her high Ghanaian cheekbones, her full lips, and the complete self-possessed composure of a face that had been unafraid since October. "He's going to call you," she said. "Today. He wants to meet with you." She paused. "Alone. And he will tell you something that you need to hear from him directly. Not from me." He went very still. "Why?" "Because there is something he should have told you 12 years ago," she said. "And he is ready to tell you now." She held his gaze. "It is about your father." Everything he had built in 34 years, the control, the precision, the distance, the ice, the 34 years of deliberate and complete management of every variable and emotion and vulnerability, sat in this moment and did not know what to do with the expression on her face and the weight of what she had just said. He looked at her. He said, in the quietest version of his voice, the one that only existed in kitchens and cars and moments where the armor had run out of material, "What did you do in that room?" The corner of her mouth, barely, moved. "I listened," she said. "And then I told him the truth." He looked at her for a long moment. The city was around them, Seoul being Seoul, enormous and continuous and indifferent. 5 months of everything they had built together, the house and the kitchen and the plants and the driveway and the corridor and the floor and the table and the we that was building quietly in the spaces between all of it, was in the air between them on a public pavement. And then he put both arms around her. Not the controlled, deliberate gesture of a man who has chosen a moment. Not the measured tenderness of someone monitoring how much they are giving. The involuntary, total, entirely unguarded movement of a man whose body had been ahead of him for 5 months and had simply run out of patience with the gap between what it knew and what he was performing. The way his hands had moved in a driveway at the end of Part 1. The way her feet had turned around at a north exit door at the end of Part 2. His body knowing before the rest of him agreed. On a pavement. In public. In Seoul. In the middle of an afternoon with the city going about its business around them like it did not know and did not care and had no opinion about the most significant 5 seconds in 34 years of a man who had never once done anything in public that he had not decided to do. She put her arms around him. Seo Jun, from the car, looked at the ceiling for a moment. Then he looked at his hands. Then he looked at the ceiling again. Then he took out his phone and looked at nothing on it for a while. They stood on the pavement in the Seoul afternoon, her arms around the dark charcoal of his suit, her Ghanaian complexion warm against the cold bright air, for a moment that was not long by any external measure and was enormous by every internal one. Then she said, quietly, into the shoulder of his jacket, "Take me home." He pulled back. He looked at her face. "Home," he said, like he was checking the word. "Home," she said, like it was the most obvious thing she had ever said. The word sat between them on the pavement with all the weight of 5 months of a cold, silent, deliberately empty house in October learning to be something else. The house with the ginger tea and the plant on the windowsill and the east corridor window and the kitchen where the real things got said. Home. She had named it. Without ceremony, without announcement, the way she did everything that mattered. Quietly, directly, without asking the word whether it was ready to be said. He opened the car door. She got in. He got in. Seo Jun was looking through the windscreen with the expression of a man who has decided that everything he is thinking right now is best kept entirely to himself. The car moved through Seoul. On the way back his phone rang. He looked at the screen and said, "Oh." She looked out the window at the city and said, "Answer it." He answered it. The conversation lasted 4 minutes. When it ended, he set the phone in his lap and looked at the road for a long time. She did not ask. She had already understood, in the room, what O was going to tell him, and she understood that some things needed to arrive in their own time, through the right voice, in the right space. The kitchen was where the real things got said. She would wait for the kitchen. The kitchen in the evening had its own particular quality. Not the gold of the morning, more amber, more settled, the light of a space that has been inhabited all day and has absorbed it. Both plants on the windowsill, the original and the second, both growing with the specific determination of things that have been given what they need and have decided to take full advantage of it. She was at the counter when he came in. He stood in the doorway the way he had stood in doorways throughout this entire story, But differently now, in the way that everything he did had been done differently for 5 months and the difference was not going back. "Oh, called," he said. "I know," she said. She did not turn around yet. "He told me about my father," Minho said. He paused. "All of it?" She turned now. She looked at him. His face, the face she had spent 5 months learning with the complete, unhurried, total attention she brought to everything that mattered, was doing something she had never quite seen it do before. Not grief and not relief and not the controlled performance of neither. Something that lived in the space between the two of those things. Something that had been in a closed room for 12 years and someone had finally, gently, opened the window. "Come sit down," she said. He sat at the kitchen table. She brought his coffee. 2 sugars. She sat across from him, not at the far end, not at the careful managed distance of the early weeks, but close, the way she sat now, which was the way they both sat now, which was close. Neither of them spoke for a moment. Then he told her. The district. The 2 men who grew up in it before either of them was anything. The vision and the patience. The first network built together as equal partners. The promise about the 60-year network and the exploitation and the right thing to do. The death that came before the promise could be kept. The son running the empire for 12 years without knowing what it was always supposed to be for. He told her all of it in the warm amber kitchen evening, and she listened with the same quality of attention she had brought to everything in this house. Complete, unhurried, total, and when he was finished the kitchen held what had been said the way the kitchen held everything important that had ever been said in it. "Do you want to honor it?" she said. He looked at her across the table. The most honest question in 4 parts of this story. Not, will you? Not, can you? Not, is it practical or strategic or safe? Do you want to? His choice. His character. Who he actually was underneath the empire and the control and the 34 years of building walls against the thing that had walked through his door in October in working clothes and asked about coffee sugar. "Yes," he said. Without calculation. Without qualification. Without a single beat of hesitation between the question and the answer. She nodded once. "Then we will," she said. The word we landed in the kitchen, and the kitchen held it, and both of them held it, and it was the largest word in 5 months of words that had been growing steadily larger and more specific and more irreversible. Not I. Not he. We. First person plural. Present tense. Both of them. For the thing his father had built and never got to finish. For the district that O's daughter had grown up in. For the 60 years of a network that had been surviving everything because nothing had ever come for it with the right purpose. "We," he said. Very quietly. Like a man checking that he had heard correctly. "We," she said. Like the most obvious thing she had ever said. He looked at her across the kitchen table. He looked at her with a face that had no armor left in it, and had not had armor in it for some time now, and was not going to put any back. Then his hand covered hers on the table. She turned her hand over, and her fingers closed around his, and they sat in the warm amber kitchen evening with both plants on the windowsill and 2 cups of coffee, and the city outside being the city, and the word "we" still in the room where neither of them had put it back. There is a network in Seoul that has been running for 60 years. It has survived everything that has come for it because everything that has come for it has always, eventually, been absorbed or redirected or simply outweighted. Because the people who run it have been doing this for longer than anyone currently aligned against them, and they have learned, across 6 decades of survival, exactly what it takes to continue. They do not make dramatic moves. They make quiet ones. They do not respond to threats with force. They respond to threats by making the threat irrelevant before it becomes a threat. They have been doing this since before Miho's father built the first network, and before O held the patience, and before a woman from Accra and Atlanta arrived at an estate gate in October with a suitcase and a question about coffee sugar and started, quietly and completely and without announcing it, changing everything. They do not know about the we. They do not know that the empire they have been watching, the empire they assessed as no threat to them as long as it was building toward power for its own sake, has just found the purpose it was always supposed to have. They do not know about a kitchen table and 2 hands and a word that has become operational. They do not know about a woman who sat across from Chairman O in a private room and said, "Tell him yourself." But they will. And when they find out, when the we becomes a plan and the plan becomes a movement and the movement begins to dismantle what has survived everything for 60 years, they will not come for Miho first. They will come for her. Because they are the kind of people who have learned, across 60 years, that the way to stop a man who has found his purpose is not to confront the purpose. It is to remove the reason he found it. So here is the question part 4 leaves you with. John Minho has spent 34 years ensuring that nothing in his world could be used against him. He built walls and distance and ice and empire specifically to prevent the kind of leverage that other people's vulnerabilities had always provided to his enemies. And then she walked through his door and asked about coffee sugar. And now someone is going to come for her. Not like Beck. Not like Haun. Not with a 7-word message or photographs through a gate. With 60 years of experience in making threats irrelevant before they become threats. With patience. And they have just been given the most important piece of information in 60 years of watching. They know what she is to him. She had known, in the car on the way back from the establishment, that the kitchen would be where it landed. The kitchen was where everything real had been said in this house. The kitchen was where she had asked about sugar on her first day, and where Minho had first come home earlier, and where she had sat with him when the lights went out, and where she had tended a wound on his hand at midnight, and where she had put the kettle on after he said, "Please," in a driveway, and where she had made him coffee after he said, "I know," at a table, and where she had found him on the floor and refused to leave, and where the plants had lived on the windowsill through all of it. The kitchen was the center of everything this house had become. The kitchen was where they were honest. So she had waited in the car and watched Seoul move past the windows, and she had let the word home sit warm in the space between them, and she had not asked about the phone call because the phone call would arrive in the kitchen on its own terms, and she trusted that. When it did, when he told her what O had told him, the full weight of the district and the promise and the 60 years and the father who died before it could be kept and the son who had been running the empire without knowing what it was for, she received it the way she received everything in this house. With a complete, unhurried, total attention of someone who had decided a long time ago that things mattered enough to be held properly. And when he was finished, she asked him the only question that mattered. Do you want to honor it? Not, can you? Not, is it safe or strategic or survivable? Do you want to? Because she had understood from the first week in this house that the most significant difference between the John Minho the world saw and the John Minho that existed inside the control and the distance and the ice was that the inside one had always wanted the right things. He had simply been operating in a world that treated wanting the right things as a vulnerability rather than a resource. She had watched it for 5 months. The plant moved to better light. The anonymous phone call about her mother's treatment. The 4 words to Seo Jun. All of it. A man who had been doing the right thing privately and alone for 34 years because doing it publicly would have given his enemies something to use. He said yes. And she said we. And the we was not a small thing and was not a romantic thing and was not the conclusion of a love story, though it was all of those. It was primarily an operational thing. It was the specific, deliberate, irrevocable word of 2 people who had assessed the situation and assessed each other and decided, together, that this was the thing they were going to do. Not because it was safe. Not because they had a complete plan. Because it was the right thing. Because it had been sitting unresolved for 34 years and somebody needed to resolve it. We, he said. Like he was hearing it for the first time. We, she said. Like she had been saying it for months in the private interior of herself and had simply found the right moment to say it out loud. Seo Jun, who had been in the hallway outside the kitchen for the last 3 minutes and had made no sound whatsoever, and who would later claim he had simply been passing and had paused because he thought he heard something, stood against the wall and looked at the ceiling for a long moment. Then he went back to his office and he opened his contingency files and he deleted the one labeled complication and he created a new one and he named it something he had never named a file in 12 years of working beside this man. He named it Asset. And then he sat back in his chair, and he looked at the ceiling again, and he thought about a woman who had arrived at the gate in October with a single suitcase, and asked Mrs. Park about coffee sugar, and moved a dying plant to a window with better light, and closed a north exit door she had been given a code for, and found a man on a kitchen floor and refused to leave him there. He thought about all of it. Then he thought about a network that had been running in a district for 60 years and had survived everything because everything that had come for it had always, eventually, run out of purpose. He thought about we. And for the first time in 12 years of running contingencies and assessing variables and filing things carefully in the specific gray space between hope and preparation, Seo Jun allowed himself to think, they have not encountered this before. They have never encountered this. Outside the kitchen window, the city was doing what Seoul did at night, enormous and lit and continuous and carrying inside it, in one of its older, quieter districts, 60 years of something that had survived everything. And in the kitchen, 2 plants were on the windowsill doing better than expected. And 2 cups of coffee were on the table with 2 hands around them. And the word "we" was in the room, and neither of them was taking it back, and both of them understood, with the complete clarity of 2 people who have arrived somewhere together after a long journey, that the word "we" was not the end of anything. It was the beginning. And what it was beginning, what the "we" meant operationally, strategically, for the district and the network and the 60 years and the promise that had been orphaned when a man was shot in the back of a car on a Tuesday afternoon, would require everything both of them were. Everything she had learned in 5 months of paying complete attention in a world that did not expect to be paid attention to. Everything he had built in 34 years of empire that had always, it turned out, been building toward this specific purpose without knowing it. He said yes without hesitation. That was what she would carry. Not the "we." The "we" was enormous, and she would carry that too, but the yes. The specific, unqualified, unhesitating yes of a man who had been running an empire for 34 years and had just been asked whether he wanted to use it for what it had always, underneath everything, been supposed to be for. He had not run the calculation, had not assessed the risk, had not consulted the strategy or the contingency or the secondary screen. He had looked at her across the kitchen table with a face that had no armor in it, and said yes the way people say yes when the answer has been true for a very long time and is simply finally being allowed to be said out loud. She had known it would be yes. She had known it the night she sat on the edge of her bed at midnight and decided what she would and would not give to O. She had known it from the 4 words C.O. June told her about in a corridor after a kitchen floor. She had known it from a plant moved to a better window and a mother's treatment approved overnight and a please said in a driveway. All of it pointing at the same thing. A man who had been doing the right thing privately and alone for 34 years because the world he operated in treated wanting the right things as a weakness. Not anymore. They sat in the kitchen with the word "we" between them and the plants on the windowsill and the city outside and the 60 years of something that needed to be dismantled. And they were, for the first time in all 4 parts of the story, on the same side of every door. He said please in a driveway. Part 1. She said I'm not leaving without you on a kitchen floor. Part 2. She said her own name in a room of 12 men. Part 3. She said "we" at a kitchen table. Part 4. And now there is a network that has been running for 60 years. And there is an empire that was always supposed to dismantle it. And there is a man who finally knows what he was building for. And there is a woman who sat across from the most patient predator in Seoul and said tell him yourself. And there is a "we." They have not encountered this before. They have never encountered this. So here is the question that leads into the final chapter of this story. When the 60-year network finds out that the empire has a "we" in it, when they come for the woman who created that "we," the way they always come for the thing a man will not let go of, what does Zola Mensah do? Does she run? Does she let him protect her the way he has been trying to protect her since the first night she stood in his hallway and refused to be made small? Or does she do what she has done in every part of this story? Close the door she was supposed to run through, walk into the room she was supposed to stay out of, say the thing she was supposed to leave unsaid? Part 5 is the final and completed chapter of the Zola and Minho story. Everything that started in a cold house in October with a question about coffee sugar ends there. Every promise, every plant, every word, every door. Subscribe right now. Turn on every notification. Tell everyone who watched parts 1 through 4 that the final chapter is coming. Because part 5 is where everything resolves. The network. The empire. The "we." The 34 years of a man building walls against the one thing that was always going to walk through them anyway. And it ends the way all the best stories end, not with a question, but with an answer. The answer she has been living since the first morning she set a cup of coffee down with 2 sugars and turned back to the counter like it was nothing. Don't miss it.